Okay, good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Loretta Lyons. I'm the programming librarian at Guilford Free Library. We're so happy to present tonight's talk, How the Aftermath of the Civil War Helps Us Understand Trumpism, with Yale professor David W. Blight. This talk is actually part of a series which is co-sponsored by the local initiative Witness to History, Slavery in Guilford. And now I'm going to turn it over to the initiative's co-founder, Doug Nygren. Doug?
Thank you. I would like to begin by thanking the Guilford Free Library and Loretta Lyons in particular for allowing our group, Witness to History, Slavery in Guilford, to co-sponsor tonight's talk by Professor David Blight. I would also like to thank Bernard Pitterman of our team, or simply Bernie as we like to address him. He arranged and scheduled tonight's speech as well as 3 others. Please go to our website, Slavery in Guilford. Once again, Slavery in Guilford, one word, slaveryinguilford.org for details on these lectures. The library will also list them on their website. My name is Douglas Nygren. I am the chair of Witness to History. I am not a historian. I am a retired child therapist who treated abused children for nearly 30 years. In my work, I observed that trauma not treated tends to repeat in subsequent generations. I saw this many, many times. I think this is also true of nations. When I saw the Confederate flag waving inside the Capitol on January 6th, it made me think that we as a nation have not come to terms with the Civil War, our history of slavery, and racism. I have come to believe that this is as true of the North as it is the South. While in the South, the Confederate flag expresses that denial, in the North, the denial manifests itself through silence about the past and the absence of visual reminders, documenting that slavery once flourished here. Tonight, we hear Yale Sterling Professor of History, David Blight, who is also director of Yale's Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance and Abolition. He has written numerous books and articles. His book, Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American History, in American Memory, won many awards, while his Frederick Douglass Prophet of Freedom received the Pulitzer Prize for History in 2019. The subject of his talk this evening is how the aftermath of the Civil War helps us understand Trumpism. It is my pleasure to present David Blight.
Well, thank you very much, Doug. Thank you to Loretta and the Guilford Free Public Library and my friend Bernie Pitterman, who I know set this up. I'm going to put a couple of pictures up in just a couple of minutes. Let me just say at the outset that I will discuss tonight with you and welcome your questions about how the memory of the American Civil War era and of Reconstruction can help us, or warn us, if you like, about what has been happening in our country over the past, let's say, at least 4 to 5 years of the Trump era, but even a longer period back, I would suggest at least 20 years, back to the year 2000, then up through what happened with the Tea Party movement. There's a lot about Trumpism that was born in the Tea Party movement. But I'd also say this, I've done many interviews, been on many webinars, discussions of all kinds over this past year, because here we are confined to either our homes or our offices doing these things on Zoom. And I've been asked, I don't know how many times, lots of times, this kind of question we're facing here tonight. The only other election or inauguration transition of power to really compare, now that we've seen the aftermath of this election, the only one really to compare to in our history is probably 1860. That's unfortunate because that's the one election in our history where the side that lost truly refused to accept the result. At least 11 states refused to accept the result. And when Abraham Lincoln was elected as the Republican candidate, a party based almost exclusively in the North, those 11 slave states of the Deep South chose to secede from the Union. Well, 7 did it first and then 4 after the firing on Fort Sumter. We've never had another election that resulted in secession. We've never had another election that resulted in the refusal to accept its result. Now, we've had disputed elections, of course, in 1824, in 1876, and of course in 2000, an election most of us remember. That certainly was disputed. It was disputed only in one state and settled, one might say ironically, and one could still argue unconstitutionally, by the Supreme Court, rather than in the House of Representatives, which is what the Constitution actually says. At any rate, but we've never had one where the candidate who truly lost the election developed a narrative, a story over and over and over and over. In fact, he had rehearsed it for months and months and months before the election, and then rehearsed it again and again and again after the election, that it was rigged, that it was fraudulent, that there were millions of votes altered or stolen, and that he was the true winner. We had no idea that it was going to result, or at least I don't think most people did. Maybe some people in the intelligence services did, but we had very little idea that we knew there'd be a rally in Washington, but we did not know they were so organized and prepared to assault the US Capitol and try to physically stop the count of the electoral ballots. This has never happened before. So it's a genuine marker in our history. Now, I will suggest several ways here that how the memory of the Civil War and Reconstruction took shape in America over the first 50 years and even the first 100 years and right on down to today, more than 150 years later, can help us understand what we've been living through and what may be yet to come in terms of whether Trumpism, this extraordinary following that this argument of a stolen election and this candidate that, or this president who developed a kind of a cult following, a broad cult following that simply believes the stories and the conspiracies that he tells them. Now, he's not solely responsible, of course, for all these conspiracies. No one person could be. But we've got a lot to learn here about how after the American Civil War, a society struggled desperately after a vast bloodletting, a huge scale of slaughter like Americans have never experienced before that or any time since. How this country put itself back together, or did it put itself back together? And how did it try to find a balance? And this is our challenge now too, a balance between justice on the one hand, which had many definitions, and healing on the other hand, which also had many definitions. We are living in a circumstance right now where we are trying to understand if there is any kind of path to unity in this country, and it often seems daily now that there's not much of a good path, but if there's a path to unity, how do we do it? And how do we find unity and healing, if you like, and still have justice? How do we find that balance? Well, let me go back. First of all, I want to show you two images of two Civil War monuments that are very different. And yes, thank you, Loretta. If you could put up that first one from Charleston. I'll be brief with these images, but I just want to show you a contrast between that's great right there. That'd be fine, because I want them to see the base of the monument in particular. This is a monument in Charleston, South Carolina. If you're familiar with Charleston, it's in Battery Park, right down on the harbor. It looks out directly at Fort Sumter, which is well over a mile out in the mouth of the harbor. It is called the Monument to the Confederate Defenders of Charleston. It was erected late in the Confederate monument building process. I believe it was the 1930s. But the most important thing on this, and you can see it's a completely classical sculpture, I guess an angel of some sort, a guardian behind the Roman soldier, I suppose, a naked soldier with shield and sword, reaching for, ancient classical meanings and roots. But it's the inscription around the bottom that I want to point to. When Charleston decided to put up this monument to the defenders of Charleston, way late in the game of Confederate monument building, here's the inscription they put on the bottom. You can only see part of it, but I'll read it. It reads, "Count them happy who for their faith and courage endured a great fight." Once more, count them happy who for their faith and courage endured a great fight. Now, it doesn't tell you anything else about Fort Sumter, where the Civil War started. It didn't tell you anything more about how many people from Charleston died in this war. It gives you no details whatsoever. It's just a stunning monument. Whatever your tastes are in monuments, it draws you because of the statuary. But then when you walk around it and you read that, what are you being told? Well, not much, but you're being told that the Civil War was just a great fight. It was a great fight. And those who died, count them happy for their courage and devotion. They endured a great fight. All I want to suggest here is that inscription on that monument represents so vividly, even though it's such a vague statement, it represents vividly what happened to so much of Civil War memory as reconciliation and reunion began to set into the culture. That didn't happen overnight, but over time, by the late 19th century, early 20th century, through a lot of blue-gray reunions, through a lot of culture of reconciliation, and reconciliation now between white Southerners and white Northerners. It simply became that kind of nostalgic, colossal experience in the past, and everybody fought for the right. Those who survived, count them happy. In other words, a war where the causes on both sides didn't even matter anymore. What's the Civil War about in that monument? You have no clue. All right, go to the next image if you would, Loretta. A second monument. This one is in Boston, Massachusetts. Many of you, of course, are New Englanders and have perhaps been to this monument. There it is. This is the Great Shaw Memorial. It's at the corner of Boston Common, directly across the street from the Massachusetts State Capitol. It is to some people, depending on who you talk to, the greatest work of art, at least in Civil War statuary, if for that matter, one of the greatest public works of monumental art ever done by an American. This was done by Augustus St. Gaudens, America's greatest 19th century public sculptor, a man who was actually raised in New York City, French Huguenot background. He was a prodigy as a child. I don't want to go into it too deeply, but this kid was an artist from his childhood. He got into good art schools. He ended up studying in Europe, in both Paris and Rome, where he studied at great length the great bas-relief techniques of the 19th century. He came back to the United States. He made a living for a while just making cameos, but then he started doing commissioned sculptures of all kinds, especially about the Civil War in the late 19th century. The famous Abraham Lincoln that stands in Lincoln Park in Chicago, that standing Lincoln with his head slightly bowed. I actually have the bust of it here because that's what you get if you win the Lincoln Prize, the book prize. Many, many others. In New York City, if you're familiar with New York, the Admiral Farragut Monument down in Union Square was one of St. Gaudens's earliest monuments. And that baby is a masterpiece because it actually shows Farragut on his ship, sort of tilted. But this was St. Gaudens's masterpiece. It wasn't unveiled until 1897 in Boston. He worked for some 18 years on this piece. He did it up at his studio in New Hampshire, which is right across the border from Vermont, or not too far from Hanover, New Hampshire. And it's now a national park site up there. His beautiful kind of farmstead studio is where he created this. A couple little details. You'll note the black soldiers behind the man on the horseback. The man on the horseback is Colonel Robert Shaw, who was the commander of the famous 54th Massachusetts Black Regiment, the first black regiment in the Civil War to be recruited in the North. It wasn't the first black regiment, but this regiment was recruited from all over the northern states, and even some of them came from the Caribbean. It was a truly national regiment. They were assembled in Boston by the state of Massachusetts in the spring of 1863, and they were sent to South Carolina with an extraordinary march down Beacon Street. This monument stands and will stand forever right there on Beacon Street, right where they turned off Tremont Street onto Beacon, and marched out to the wharf onto the ships that took them to South Carolina and their appointment with their fate at the Battle of Battery Wagner on the beaches around Charleston in July of '63. But what St. Gaudens was trying to capture in this monument was the march of the 54th Mass on the day they were sent off to war before a huge crowd of thousands of people in Boston. Shaw on the horseback is exactly the way it occurred at the time. A colonel would ride on his horse. It isn't just because he's the white officer, but behind him are the soldiers. There are 22 individual faces in this monument of black men and very young boys. If you look at the front of that line, you see the drummer boy. That kid couldn't be more than 14 at most. Now, what St. Gaudens actually did is he went into the train stations of New York City and Boston and just started trying to meet black men. I'm not kidding. He recruited them of all ages, because he knew in the 54th there were men of all ages. The oldest member of the regiment that actually went to South Carolina was in his late 50s, and some of them were young teenagers. He recruited them to come up to New Hampshire to his studio, and they did. And he made models of their heads, and many of those models are still there, although you can see some of those models now at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And in this creation, 22 different faces of those men appear, and they are thoroughly individualized and humanized. This is commemorating an actual event, the March of the 54th down Beacon Street in late May 1863. But here's the key. When we think about Civil War monuments, I just showed you the one in Charleston, where it has that inscription that gives you absolutely no sense of what the war was somehow about. This monument is all about the causes of this war. These men are black soldiers, many of them former slaves, although many of the members of the 54th were born free in northern states. They are marching forward down the street, across the Boston Common, out to the wharf and off to war. But when you know the history of what happened, you know that about one half of them are really marching to their deaths. And they were the test regiment. They were to be the regiment that would test, could black men actually become soldiers? Could black men learn and be trained and learn musketry and all the rest? And would they fight? Well, the 54th definitely fought, and they were sent into a situation where they had no chance, an almost suicidal slaughter along the beaches on Morris Island around the harbor of Charleston. But what you really see here are the movement of the bodies. This is a great artistic achievement. And the depth of that monument from, say, out at the point of Shaw's sword and his boot to the rear of the wall of the monument is barely 2.5 feet, maybe 3. I don't even think it's 3 feet. But what St. Gaudens achieved in this monument artistically is just magnificent. But the most important point here is, what is the Civil War about? Well, by the summer of 1863, it was a war to destroy slavery. And it was now also being fought, not just by white soldiers, but by black soldiers, who, in the sensibilities of most Americans, had to die to be recognized as men. This monument tells a story, a deep story. This story of Civil War memory is not the one that caught on most deeply in most of American culture in the 50 years and more after the American Civil War. It did in Boston, it did on this monument, and it still does. Okay, Loretta, you can remove the pictures now, and I'll just carry on a bit here. Thank you. So I want to just discuss briefly what I did with that book called Race and Reunion, which is frighteningly now almost 20 years ago. I did kind of what historians do. I did a vast amount of research for years, all over the South, all over the North. But then I boiled things down to 3 kinds of Civil War memory. And there may actually be a 4th. There have been other books written since. I've had a few critics who have suggested I might have left one out. That's fine, and I'll mention that. But the first form of Civil War memory that took hold in this culture, I called a reconciliationist memory. This took root in the process of dealing with the dead on a scale Americans had never imagined. Approximately 750,000 Americans died in the Civil War. Most of them in graves that were never marked, unknown. The second kind of memory I called the Emancipationist memory. That Shaw Memorial, that's Emancipationist memory. That's the kind of memory that was embodied in the way the war came to ultimately destroy slavery, had to destroy slavery in order to defeat the Confederacy, to conquer the South. And in the launch of Black freedom, out of which came the 3 great Civil War amendments, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment bringing about equality before law and birthright citizenship. That Section 1 of the 14th Amendment is possibly the single most important language in our Constitution now. And Emancipationist memory was also embodied by the radical wing of the Republican Party in the immediate wake of the Civil War. They brought about a political revolution. It became a new interracial, or it became an experiment, at least, in interracial democracy on the ground in the South and on the ground to some degree in the North. It's not going to hold. It's going to get defeated by the white South, by violence, by terror, by the Ku Klux Klan, by a Great Depression that hit the country in 1873. But it was a revolution that gave us a new constitution and, frankly, a new republic. The third kind of memory in that book, and this is a term you hear a very great deal now, is what I called white supremacist memory. This was the memory rooted in the idea that the 2 races, white and black at least, could never really be equal. The assumption so many people held in the 19th century that this could never work. that emancipation had, had been a result of the war, but that it had come too fast, and it had come by violence and force, and that blacks were unprepared, so went the argument, and even incapable of living as free citizens. That's what white supremacy really says, it really is, really means. It's a set of assumptions about the capacities of one race held by people of another race, or people even generally. Now, what happened to American memory of this war is that reconciliationist memory kind of linked arms with white supremacist memory. They became kind of the same thing in some settings by the 1880s, 90s, turn of the 20th century, that they delivered the country a, by and large, racially segregated meaning and memory of the Civil War by 1900, and certainly by 1913 at its 50th anniversary. There is a fourth kind of memory that a few of my colleagues and fellow scholars have suggested over time, and I'll at least name it. And that is, some people say there was also this large, and for a while at least powerful, kind of Union victory memory. That is, Northerners, every chance they got, saying, we won, we saved the Union, we gave it new life, and yes, we freed the slaves. Now, we freed the slaves, though, was not always the same thing as a commitment to African-American civil and political rights, or to any kind of racial equality, or even to working against the problem of violence and eventually lynching in the southern states. But there certainly was a culture of Union victory practiced by veterans organizations and by many other people. But again, as I hinted earlier, the problem this country faced, and here's where we can begin to think ahead as we try to live out of this era of Trumpism, however one defines that. And I can provide some definitions if you wish. As we live out of this era of Trumpism, as we live beyond this second impeachment trial, as we live with the growing legacy of 6 January and what happened with the assault on the US Capitol, as we will begin to see prosecutions of hopefully at least the 150 or so people who've been arrested, and one would hope even 200, 300, 400, 500 more. How will we find a balance from our own recent traumas between healing and justice? What will justice mean in the wake of the Trump presidency? Justice for whom? Justice how? Justice how enacted? In law, in policy, and in courtrooms. What will healing mean? Does it just mean neighbors learning to talk to each other again? Maybe. I doubt that that's enough in my own view. Is healing going to mean a president like Joe Biden, who is almost congenitally a man who wants to build unity, who has lived his life in a bipartisan world of the United States Senate? And even when he was vice president, part of his job was to go to Capitol Hill and find some Republicans who would talk. Now, they didn't find many, did they? The Affordable Care Act was passed, don't forget, through that reconciliation process, because not a single Republican would support it. What will healing and justice be? There were so many different warring definitions in the wake of the American Civil War of what healing or justice was supposed to mean. It is why they never fully developed in balance. And that is the tragedy of the memory of the Civil War. How many warring definitions do we have right now of what justice and healing will be or would be in balance? Will we find that balance in some policies to come out of Congress? Will we find some balance between healing and justice in the COVID relief package, when and if it finally ever gets passed? Will we find some balance between healing and justice in action taken about the climate crisis? Will we find healing and justice in action taken to try to rebuild America's infrastructure? And what about our oldest, deepest, most vexing problem of all, race? What kind of policies will bring us together, to use that overused phrase, but there really isn't a better one, around the question of racial equality, genuine equality, genuine dignity, dignity in action, dignity in practice, dignity in law. There's a reason these things are not easy. It's because you're trying to reconcile tremendous conflict. I can still remember, this goes back 10, 11 years or something. I sit on the board of trustees of the New York Historical Society, although it baffles me now why they haven't thrown me off, because I've missed so many meetings in recent years. They like to keep a few historians on, I guess, because I do things for them. But anyway, I was at a board meeting of the New York Historical Society somewhere around, I don't know, 2009 or 10 or somewhere in there. It was right after Obama's election. It was the Tea Party was sinking its teeth in. You remember all those incredible protests against Obama? Vicious imageries, and a lot of terrible stuff was going down. And the board of the New York Historical Society was then, and it's a little different now, but was then about roughly 30, 35 pretty rich New Yorkers who love history, and some remarkable philanthropists. And then about maybe 3, 4, 5 historians who were there to just to be historians, I guess. And I don't even know what the issue was now, but we had this rather vexing discussion. It was about a new exhibition they were going to do. And that, I think, was about the time they were doing the second exhibition on slavery in New York and up through the Civil War. And it was a little contentious. And one member of that board, who I don't even remember which one now, but I do remember what he said. He said, you know, I love history, but why can't we just write history and teach history about people of goodwill? Why can't we just find the goodwill in the past that will help us cultivate goodwill now in the present? And you know, it was a lovely sentiment in a way, but I remember thinking at that time, I didn't say anything. I mean, it wasn't my place to denounce this man's theory of history, but I thought, goodwill? Goodwill? Historians don't study goodwill. We have to study the conflicts. We have to study the blood. We have to study the struggle. And if there'd been goodwill to find, we might not have had that bloodletting in the 1860s. And what followed in the aftermath, a lot more bloodletting across the South, and estimated around 3,000 to 3,500 people killed by the Ku Klux Klan alone. And goodwill? Come on. It's not what history's about. So here we are. I want to say a few more things about this problem of Civil War memory, and then help perhaps transition for us into our own present and our own struggles with these issues. Now, first of all, there's a difference between history and memory. It's very important to try to keep this in mind. History tends to be what historians do, the histories we write, and then the teaching of history. The teaching of history, we like to think, or we hope, is based upon a process by which the best historical writing over time gets into textbooks, gets into teaching materials, gets into the jigsaws and the diagrams and the timelines and all of the materials of teaching young people. We hope. And great strides have been made in this in the past half century. I know that from working for 25 years and more with secondary teachers and summer institutes, from being a co-author on a college level American history textbook. Things are very different now in some ways from when I started as a high school teacher in 1971. History tends to be the process by which we go from libraries and archives to historians to teachers, and then a narrative, a story, a sense of history into the minds of youth and into the minds of adults. Memory, however, is in some ways, many ways, a very different thing. Collective memory, historical memory. Think about how we talk about history. Well, history gets revised, right, by historians. Some people hate that word revision, although that's exactly what history is. You don't want your doctor not to be a revisionist, do you? You don't want him to remain an alchemist from the Middle Ages. You want him to learn. Well, historians learn too, and we sometimes change our interpretations. But what do we do with memory? We don't usually revise memory much. Memory comes down to us from family. It comes down to us from institutions like church and schooling. It comes to us from popular culture. It comes to us from the movies. It comes to us through images. It comes to us from our grandparents. It comes to us in political rhetoric. We have just lived through 4 to 5 years of an incredibly powerful and mostly insidious use of memory by a particular kind of populist demagogue named Donald J. Trump. Make America great again? Well, where in the past was he looking to find that greatness? What does MAGA really mean? What story had the Trumpists been telling themselves? What story, think of it this way, what stories were roiling around in the heads of those thousands of rioters that assaulted the US Capitol? What historical memories were in their heads? What story were they acting on? Was that history from history books? Oh, some of them would tell you it was. They were going to have, remember the shouts of this was their 1776. They were rebelling against, I guess, centralized power, like the American patriots were against Great Britain. And I guess hanging Mike Pence was, I don't know, for some of them, maybe that was going to be their tarring and feathering of a British official moment or something. But memory tends to be more powerful than history. That's unfortunate. I'm a historian. I believe in evidence. I believe in facts. I believe in trying to find the stuff and then write my story based on that. And if I can't say I believe this is the truth, I shouldn't write it. Yeah, we all have a point of view. Of course we do. And many of us write history that we want to persuade people with. Your favorite historians are those who persuade you. They're also those who probably write the best. But memory comes to us as told through the generations. Memory tends to be what people want to possess. People want to give it over to their children, their grandchildren. It is sometimes sacred. History, on the other hand, is essentially secular. It can be done by anyone. It can be written by anyone. It can belong to everyone. Memory, though, is often closed off. You're part of a memory community. You're part of a memory group. Irish Americans, Italian Americans, African Americans, Mormon Americans, make your list, go on and on and on. Here's our story. And here's our link to the larger story. But don't you mess up our story with all of your pickpocketing of evidence out of all your libraries full of eggheads. But you know, this thing called memory, we can't live with it and we can't live without it. That's the power of it. That's the trouble of it, but it is with us forever. One of my favorite pieces, and there are a million pieces of writing on memory. In fact, there would be no writing without memory. There'd be no great fiction without memory. What are novelists writing? But something that comes out of their memory, even when they deny it. One of my favorite pieces, though, of all time was written in the 4th century. It's by St. Augustine in the Confessions. He has about a 40-page section in that great book on the nature of memory. He actually just reflects on and on and on and on about what is this thing humans have, this most powerful thing he thinks that humans have. He said, memory, these are his words, is a vast court. It was the treasury in our mind. Beautiful phrase. Also, it can be dangerous. He said it was a great chamber. And he said, no one, this is St. Augustine's words, no one has sounded the bottom thereof. In other words, memory is potentially limitless. Even though we all know we forget a lot, don't we? Every day we forget things. We know that from neuroscience research. And then Augustine said, quote, great is the power of memory, a fearful thing. Oh my God, he said, a deep and boundless manifoldness. And this thing is the mind, and this am I myself. It was Augustine's way of saying, I think, that we are our memories. They speak to us, they define us, we sometimes resist them. They sometimes, our memories may feel like they control us. We try to control them back. They can be elusive, and they can sometimes just come around and smack us between the eyes when we least expect it. Memory is both individual, of course, and collective. And for Americans, like other peoples, we live in a society that has always had a variety of narratives it believes it's living in. Master narratives. And one of the oldest and most enduring master narratives of America is the story, irresistible often, that America was born into this universe for a purpose, that it was chosen. Now, you can believe that on a sacred or a secular level, but it came out of this Enlightenment world, this remarkable republic, where there were so few of them. It had to fight this revolution. It had this difficult, violent birth. Its Articles of Confederation didn't work, so it wrote this Constitution, this amazing Constitution. Yes, it had flaws, but my God, what an amazing Constitution. James Madison, what a genius. And then it has to live about 80 some years under this Constitution, this vast, expanding people across this seemingly limitless continent. But oh boy, it had a problem. This huge and growing dilemma with slavery and race. And it had this big collision and it fought this civil war, but the nation survived. We got better for it. We unified from it. Yeah, it was bloody, but it was a happy fight. We came out of it all right. We grew out of it all right. Yeah, and then we had other problems along the way. We had depressions and we had world wars. Oh my God, but we win our world wars. And we did indeed fought on the side of the angels in the Second World War. And without the United States, there wouldn't have been a victory over fascism. Let's just say it. Yeah, my father was a 4.5-year veteran of World War II. I think I get that. But we haven't always been the nation of progress. We haven't always been the nation that is always somehow getting better. It depends on who you ask. It depends on when you look. It depends on where you look. Now, I just want to say a couple other things here about our own dilemmas right now. We don't know yet whether Trumpism and Donald Trump himself is an emerging lost cause ideology. We do know that after the Civil War, the Confederate cause, defeated on the ground, defeated in war, nevertheless with time became an ideology, a lost cause, a virulent lost cause, a story that said the most noble side in a great conflict doesn't necessarily win. The most noble side that loses can be more righteous than the victor. They will argue, or they did argue, that they were never really defeated on the battlefield, which isn't true at all. But they will say they weren't really defeated on the battlefield, and that they were only defeated by the superior numbers and industry of the North, by the Yankee Leviathan. And then they will argue vehemently that they never fought for slavery. They didn't really fight for slavery, they argued. And I'm not doing this in jest. This is what they argued. And some people still do. They said they only fought for their sovereignty, for their home, for hearth and home and state sovereignty against that increasingly imperialistic, centralized federal government. And they will even argue that not only they did not fight for slavery, but the slaves were essentially a contented lot. And the faithful slave imagery became part and parcel of the lost cause ideology. And deep in the lost cause ideology was this, all these assumptions, this faith in white supremacy. And last but not least, the loss caused by the 1880s, 90s, and into the 20th century was eventually not about loss at all. It was about victory. And it was the victory narrative they told themselves and the nation. It was a victory over Reconstruction. It was defeating Reconstruction, which was a national triumph, and putting Black Americans back into the status that they were naturally made for, and hence the Jim Crow system. If we are seeing, and we don't know yet, but if we are seeing Trumpism morphing into some kind of lost cause ideology, here's the question. Does it really have the ingredients to become a lasting lost cause ideology? The original Confederate lost cause had martyrs aplenty. They had the dead soldiers. Trumpists don't have that, at least not yet. They did have a kind of saint-like cult figure in Robert E. Lee. This current crop of people has Trump. Now, whether he fulfills that role yet or not, we don't know. But what Trumpism does have is a set of beliefs, a set of narratives, a story about America that apparently millions of people believe in. Lost causes are a set of beliefs looking for a history to tie them to. The question is how enduring the beliefs at the core of Trumpism actually are. We just don't quite know yet. The votes of some 44 Republican senators this week may tell us something about whether Trumpism will endure, at least for a while, as a kind of lost cause. I think I should stop there because I was told we don't really want to run past 8 o'clock, but I am happy to take any and all questions and comments. And I know there are some already, and I believe Loretta, Doug, and Bernie are going to funnel them to me. There's much, much more to say, but that gives us a start. Thank you.
We'll start with a question about memory, Professor Blight, from Miles Alderman. With memory being so powerful.
Hello, Miles. Good
friend,
to see you.
with memory being so powerful, How do we change it when it is in conflict with the facts and with the truth?
Well, I've had that question a lot lately, and it's a tough one, Miles, but all I can say is this, and it's probably what you feel too, I would guess. We have to do what we know how to do best. We can't go out and whack people over the head and say, you know what, you're really stupid. No, you can't do that. That isn't going to work. If we are in the truth business, if we are in the education business, if we are in the knowledge business, and I'm talking about everybody from an elementary school teacher to university professors, we have to keep explaining to our students, explaining to the society around us, that truth matters, that facts matter, that you need to put your facts in an order and then tell a story from it. I think the single greatest, shall we say, achievement, you could say evil achievement, of Trump's presidency and Trumpism, and by that I don't just mean Donald Trump, but he's been enabled by lots of media and lots of people. The single greatest achievement is rendering truth irrelevant, to the point where we all know we are living in separate societies of knowledge, separate universes of information, and one pounding the other sometimes with this information. I do think one pounds harder than the other. So Miles, we gotta do what we know how to do and do it better. Now, everyone likes to say, you know, history's so badly taught in this country, and on and on and on and on. And yes, there's a lot of truth to that. But I also know there are thousands, even millions of great history teachers in this country. I know a lot of them. I've worked in the summers with hundreds and hundreds of them. I still do webinars and seminars online now with teachers who are yearning to get to go back and have a graduate seminar or something for a week, who are yearning for better information to teach this part, better information to teach that part of our history. And you know, the one area that is getting so much more attention now, and God, it's high time, is the era of Reconstruction. Because we keep wondering, if the civil rights era is called the second Reconstruction, so what was the first Reconstruction? And if everyone now is talking about how we're going to need a third Reconstruction, well, what was the first one? What is this 14th Amendment everyone's talking about? The 14th Amendment is right there in the impeachment article on Trump. It's section 3, which nobody ever talks about. It's the one that says anyone who aids and abets rebellion against the United States shall be disfranchised. I happen to think Donald Trump's, not only Donald Trump's ability to ever hold office again should be taken from him, but he should be disfranchised from even voting based on the 14th Amendment.
Okay.
Go ahead, Loretta.
One more. There's a few actually. How does the War of Northern Aggression story of the Civil War fit into your 3rd and/or 4th narrative version of the Civil War?
Well, it fits perfectly into the white supremacist version of memory, and I would urge people to read that book, Race and Reunion, and there are now a good handful of other really good books on Civil War memory that have happened in the past 20 years. But it also fits to some degree into the reconciliationist kind of memory. There were many people by the turn of the 20th century, even in the North, who bought into this idea that, you know, okay, if we'd have left slavery alone to the South, it would have waned out on its own. If the early Republican Party under Lincoln hadn't been so aggressive and pushing the war when they did, there could have been further compromises. In fact, there was a scholarship arguing this by the wake of World War I, when many historians have become very disillusioned about war. People like Avery Craven and many, James G. Randall famously wrote that what really got us into the American Civil War was just overblown, vicious politics. If there'd been more decent, unifying healers, we wouldn't have had to have that war. After World War II, along came another generation of scholars and said, oh, no, you weren't even looking at the right questions. That war was all but inevitable. So the idea of war, northern aggression, that old idea that this all came about because of Yankee aggression to want to invade the South, control the South, remake the South, and so on and so on. It had a lot of followers, and it fit into at least two of my three categories of Civil War memory in different ways.
Okay. A question from Daniel Steinbach. What was the balance struck between healing and justice after the Civil War? Are there lessons for today from that experience?
Yes, and the greatest lesson is there are always losers. There are always costs in reconciliations. I mean, think about it. Whether it's a reconciliation in an extended family or it's a reconciliation between two groups that have been warring with one another. Think about Northern Ireland. Think about a lot of places in the world. People have to give up something. There are costs in reconciliation. The great cost, though, the great tragedy of Civil War memory in this country is that the cost was in the liberties and the lives of African Americans. The single greatest result of our Civil War, along with preserving and reinventing the Union, was the freedom of 4 million slaves who were freed into initially a process of the beginnings, at least, of civil and political rights. Those rights were first eroded, then all but defeated, and then crushed by roughly the turn of the 20th century. So the reconciliation that occurred in America, and it did have to occur, a reunion of North and South had to happen, no question. But it happened on the backs and at the cost of Black people and their liberties and their lives.
So a question from Kate Haggins. How do historians define lies?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, you know, we used to think, well, we don't really have to answer that. We do now, don't we? We live in a time when that word lie is being used the big lie, right? People have been rereading George Orwell, and we've been learning a lot about the kinds of lies Nazism made into brilliant propaganda. Well, there are many kinds of lies. There are big lies and small lies. I would refer to you here to some of the recent journalistic writing of my good colleague, Tim Snyder, in the Yale History Department, who writes about Eastern European and even Russian history. But he's had a lot to say recently about the scaling of lies. You know, there are small lies that a political regime can tell about, I don't know, who gets health care and who doesn't, although that's a pretty big idea. You know, they're smaller, a little bit bigger lies you can tell about, say, Social Security and how it works, or some other policy and how it works. But a big lie is something like the stab in the back theory of the 1920s that the Nazis used to build their movement. The stab in the back, they argued, and Hitler had argued in Mein Kampf, and many others had, is the Jews sold Germany down the drain in World War I and in the wake of World War I, and that Germany had to rise again, and they were going to have to get rid of the Jews to do it. The big lie we're living with now, of course, and it is a bold-faced, unequivocal lie, and you can see it over and over and over now in the impeachment manager's use of video, is Donald Trump's idea that he really won the election. He not only says he won the election, he says he won by a, quote, massive landslide. Now, you know, there's not only no evidence for that, it just violates and flies in the face of numerous court decisions, of all the counts done at state levels, counts done by Republicans, counts done by Democrats, and so on and so forth. A big lie is also a big social, political, historical lie, is, I would argue, from our understanding of history, it's a lie that leads to conquest. It's a lie that leads to the killing of people, and often the slaughter of people, and in some cases genocides against people. Where do we put the lies about racism? Where do we put, are they lies or just assumptions? Are they lies or just brutal ignorance? We always argue about, well, so what is racism? Well, it's ignorance, it's fear. It's all these psychological notions about how people end up fearing the other. Well, it's true. Stereotypes are part of it. Assumptions that kids learn and grow up with. Black people, brown people, whatever, Slavic people, they're not good at this, they're not good at that. They can do that, but not this. Okay, those can be small lies to begin with, kids on a playground. But when they become an ideology and they become a political force, and then they become an army, then they're very big lies with tremendous consequences. I guess I would suggest we think about Trumpism. I think it has to be seen as a political ideology, but it can be broken down into a series of small to bigger to big lies about America, about our history. Let me give you an example here of where the word lie is tricky, but at some point you almost have to use it. And that is about this recent so-called 1776 commission report or project put together by Trump's White House hastily back in September when they held, I'm being frank here, that ridiculous conference at the National Archives. And they announced that we were going to get back to telling a wholesome story about the greatness of America and about freedom. And then, literally just before he left office, on Martin Luther King Day, they issued this report. I forget how many pages. I actually read most of it. I forced myself to read most of it. It infuriated me. I got so angry, I went crazy on Twitter for an evening. And I gained several thousand more followers on Twitter. I haven't said anything quite as vociferous since, but that report was packed full of these ideas that American history really is a pleasing story. It exists to please us. It exists for us to see the unfolding of liberty and freedom. And what it had to say, actually its longest section was about the place of slavery in the United States and what it had to say about slavery, and this is my field, I run a center that studies this, was just appalling. The role of slavery at the American founding, the role of slavery in the growth of the United States. That report essentially did what a lot of the lost cause ideology did after the Civil War. It said, slavery wasn't something anyone was really responsible for. It was just a system that ended up here, kind of like the weather. You don't have to call that a lie to just say that it's egregiously wrong and dangerous. I would prefer those terms than a lie, because a lie puts people in the mental framework of just true or false. And history is not about true and false questions. It's about understandings. It's about how forces collide in history and then develop this and become that. And by the way, that report said that so many American university professors and so many teachers in this country are teaching American youth to hate their country. That is a lie, or mostly a lie. I've been teaching since, I'll admit it, 1971. I don't want to do the math. That's a lot of years. I started as a high school teacher. I've taught in a large public high school. I've taught in small liberal arts colleges. I've taught in two of them. And I've now taught in two great universities. I've been here at Yale now 17, 18 years. I don't teach my history courses to make anybody hate anything. I teach them to have a skeptical mind I hope I'm teaching them how to be critical of sources and critical of our own narratives. But when I find something to celebrate in the past, I celebrate it. When I find something that moves me, I let them know I'm moved by it. When I find something that is brutal and evil, I call it that. That's our job.
Okay, one or two more if you're willing.
Sure.
From Babs Rawls Ivy. Hi, how can we use history to move us forward in all matters of race, equity, and inclusion? We did the Frederick Douglass Oratory and Declaration of Independence last year for the 4th of July.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, the Douglas 4th of July speech is being used more and more around the country on 4th of July in civic spaces of all kinds. I love that. I think it's great. How can we use history to bring us together more around race and race relations? By learning more of it, by learning a good deal more of it. It doesn't mean we just have to learn more Black heroes to go with white heroes. The Black experience and Black history is not just about searching for heroes. Lots of Black people in our past have been full of skullduggery like anyone else. But what we can do is get closer and closer and closer to what race actually is, which is a biological fiction and a social historical reality. We need to learn what race actually is first. Then we need to begin to understand, why did it affect our laws so much then in that context? Why did it affect our laws differently in this context? Why did this Supreme Court decision come about? Because of race. Why did that one come about? Because of that or this. And actually, if you look, you know, it's not a fiction to say that the Black experience is central to American history. There's no question about that. That to say that race and the Black experience is a central thread of our history is true. Look at so many of the most important Supreme Court decisions in our history. Start wherever you want. Start with the Dred Scott case, the worst of all. That's all about slavery and race. Go into the Reconstruction years. The great Supreme Court cases are all about interpretations of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, which wouldn't have existed without the freedom of the slaves, was essentially erased by the decisions of the 1870s and 1880s. Look at the Plessy v. Ferguson case of the 1890s. Come on up ahead to the great turning point of the Brown case and many cases before that. Brown case in 1954 and on and on and on. Down to John Roberts's vote in the 5-4 Shelby v. Holder case of 2013, I believe, which wiped out the Voting Rights Act. We need to be raising people who understand some of these nuts and bolts. They need to know what the Brown decision was. They need to know what the Shelby v. Holder case was. They need to know what Dred Scott did. And they should know the 1883 civil rights cases. It's a crucial Supreme Court decision. But then they need to understand that, you know, racism in this era wasn't the same thing as it was in that era. And it's not the same thing now. It's one of the reasons I get a little upset. And it's, again, the press again today, all over the place. When people have adopted this phrase now, 400 years, for 400 years, we've been this racist society. For 400 years, we've been living the legacies of slavery. Well, that's partly true. But racial assumptions, racism, the Black experience itself, Americans dealing with questions of race is not the same thing in 1800 that it was in 1900, that it was in 2000. History is about change over time. So we have to do two things. We have to learn more history itself, and then we have to learn more about what history actually is. What it means to have a sense of history, what it means to know that the past really shapes us, that the present is always hand in glove with the past. I always assumed that my primary objective in any history course I teach, even to brilliant kids at a place like Yale, is that they walk out of my class with a sense of history, whatever the details. I want them to know the details too, but with a sense of history that I hope will have been emboldened in them, that they know wherever they do with their lives, wherever they go, the past has shaped them, and it continues to every day.
Well, I think that might be a nice note to end on, unless
Sure, you don't want to pummel me with a couple more.
if you're willing, there's a few more. It's up to you.
Well, give me one more. I'll take one more.
Um,
And if I blow it, it's all my fault.
this might be, this is kind of about your story of being on the board of directors. Wouldn't it be better, this is from Daniel Rabin, wouldn't it be better to replace foul memories with productive memories rather than trying to overcome them with secular reasoning?
Boy, there's a lot in that question.
Yeah.
Secular reasoning, was it foul memories, and what's the other thing?
Wouldn't it be better to replace foul memories with productive memories? I think maybe along the lines of what you were speaking about on the goodwill, rather than trying to overcome them with secular reasoning.
Well, I'm not sure what secular reasoning may necessarily mean, but I think you're going to have to know the foul, what may have caused foul memories first before you can make them productive. I mean, I actually believe that we use the past. The best way we can use the past is to do what I guess the psychologists call working it through. Knowing history is a process to some extent of letting it kind of wash over us. Oh, I know this now about 1850s America, but now I know this too, and I know a little more about why the political parties were beginning to break apart, and I know a little bit more about westward expansion, how much of it, and I begin to learn a little bit more about why Northerners was so concerned that they didn't want slavery out in those territories. And I learned a little bit more and a little bit more, and pretty soon, the productive part, sir, comes when the more we know about it, we can begin to understand why this foul conflict, if that's what we wanted, this brutal conflict was coming about, why they couldn't seem to reach any compromise. I am not absolutely certain what he means by secular reasoning as opposed to sacred reasoning.
He has the question of, was it about fighting memory with history versus fighting a bad memory with a good memory?
Oh, I see. Well, I employed the word secular about doing history as opposed to gaining our memories. So maybe I'm at fault for bringing that up. I think this question has a key point, though. We do want to use the past to make our lives more productive, if that means more morally productive, more ethically productive, more productive in a kind of civic consciousness. You know, learning history is at least one way of gaining a civic consciousness. Who am I? What is this society made of? What is this constitution we have? So I'm all for productive uses of the past, but you got to know it first, and you got to face it down. If the question stems in some ways, and I'll finish with this, from the persistence, and I know this happens, that now we have history being taught by a lot of people who are showing the darker sides of our history. Well, that's true. And I sometimes think that can be overdone. Yes, I do. I have no problem to some degree celebrating the founding fathers. Yes, many of them were slaveholders. John Adams was not a slaveholder, but he had a lot of flaws too. He was an amazing mind. But they did create a remarkable thing, a republic out of an idea. And they did craft a constitution, much of which still survives, although it had to be reinvented. in 1865 to 1868. And you all live today under that Constitution, not under the original one. Well, thank you, everybody. It's been great to spend this evening with people from Guilford to near and far. I heard from an old neighbor today who I know lives up in Vermont, who somehow got wind of this, and I think he was on here tonight. So.
Thank you very much, Professor Blight. It's a real pleasure.
Loretta and Doug and Bernie and everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Take care.
Okay. Good
Read
night.
more history. Bye-bye. Thank you.